You remember exactly how it happened. The words, the tone, the look on their face. You've replayed it hundreds of times. You know what was said. You know how it felt. You were there. So was the other person. And they remember something completely different. Not slightly different. Not a few blurred details around the edges. A different version of reality. Different words, different emotions, a different sequence of events. And they're just as certain as you are. They're not performing certainty. They're not trying to gaslight you. They genuinely, completely remember it that way. And somewhere in that gap between two certain people is a question that most people never actually stop to ask. What if neither version is real? For most of human history, memory was treated like a storage system. Something happens. The brain captures it, files it away. When you need it, you retrieve it. Maybe the image gets a little grainy over time. Maybe some details fade. But the core of it, what actually happened, that stays intact, that's the record. It feels true. It feels like the most obvious thing in the world. You remember things. Of course you do. You've been doing it your whole life. But here's what cognitive psychologists have known for over 50 years, and what almost nobody fully accepts when they first hear it. Memory is not storage. Memory is construction. Every single time you remember something, not once, not occasionally, but every time, your brain doesn't retrieve a file. It rebuilds the experience from scattered fragments, emotional residue, sensory impressions, pieces of context, and it assembles them into something that feels complete, feels vivid, feels true, because the brain is extraordinarily good at filling in gaps. The problem is that filling in gaps means adding things that weren't there. Every reconstruction involves editing, and you never see the edits. The rebuilt version always feels exactly as real as the original moment, because to your brain, there's no difference between them. But here's what most people never notice. The editing doesn't happen once. It happens every time. Every time you remember something, you change it slightly. And then you store the change version. And the next time you remember it, you're remembering that version, not the original event, the last reconstruction of it. Think about a story you've told a dozen times, a hard conversation at work, a falling out with a friend, a moment from childhood that shaped how you see yourself. The more you've told it, the more refined it feels, the cleaner the narrative, the sharper the details. But that sharpness, that clarity, that's not accuracy, that's repetition. The story has been retold so many times that it's become smooth, like a stone worn down by water. And smooth doesn't mean true. It means practiced. The researcher who made this impossible to ignore is Elizabeth Loftus. In the 1970s, she ran a series of experiments that changed how we understand the entire architecture of human memory. She showed people footage of car accidents, ordinary crash videos. Then she asked them questions about what they'd seen. But she changed one word. Some participants were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others were asked the same question, but with the word smashed instead. One word, that's all. The smashed group estimated significantly higher speeds, and a week later, when asked whether they remembered seeing broken glass in the video, they were far more likely to say yes. There was no broken glass. It never appeared on screen. The word smashed had inserted a memory of something that never happened. Not through confusion, not through carelessness. The memory had simply been reconstructed with new material woven in, and the brain had no way to flag it as foreign. It doesn't look dramatic, but it changes everything. Because Loftus wasn't done, she went further. In later experiments, she and her colleagues implanted entirely fabricated memories into adult participants. Memories of childhood events that had never occurred. Getting lost in a shopping mall, a hospitalization, a frightening encounter. About a quarter of participants came to genuinely remember these events, not vaguely, vividly. They described details, textures, emotions they'd felt. Some expressed distress about things that had never happened to them. This is called the misinformation effect. And what makes it quietly devastating is that it doesn't require a laboratory. It doesn't require a researcher asking carefully constructed questions. It happens in conversation. It happens when someone describes your own memory back to you and uses a slightly different word. It happens when you read something that reframes an event you experienced. It happens when a parent tells you what your childhood was like. When a sibling insists you weren't there. When an old friend says, "You always did that," and suddenly, you start to believe it. The misinformation effect is not a glitch. It's a feature of a system that was built to update constantly, because a brain that could never revise the past would be far less useful than one that can. Here's the mechanism underneath all of it. And once you understand it, a lot of things start to make sense. Every time you recall a memory, it doesn't just play, it reopens. Scientists call this reconsolidation. The memory becomes temporarily unstable, malleable, open to modification, and while it's in that unstable state, it absorbs the emotional texture of the present moment. This means, if you remember a difficult period from your past while you're currently under stress, the memory gets saturated with that stress. If you revisit a happy childhood memory on a particularly hard day, a shadow gets cast across it that wasn't there before. If you remember an old argument right after a new one, it gets sharper, angrier, more damning, not because anything changed about what happened, but because of what you're feeling right now. Your brain is constantly doing something that sounds almost contradictory. It uses the past to make sense of the present, and it uses the present to update the past. Not consciously, not deliberately, quietly, automatically, without announcement. This is why two people who lived through the same relationship can describe it in ways that sound like different lifetimes. Why adult siblings can argue about a childhood home as though they grew up in different houses. Why someone can spend years carrying a version of an event that the other person involved doesn't recognize at all. They're not lying. They're not even misremembering in the way we usually mean, like forgetting a detail or mixing up a date. They're remembering their reconstruction, the version that has been rebuilt, restored, and reshaped every time they've thought about it, talked about it, or felt something adjacent to it. And that reconstruction was never just the facts. It was always the facts plus everything they felt, everything they believed, everything they needed it to mean. At every moment they revisited it. There's something even quieter happening underneath this, and it takes a moment to sit with. The stories people carry about themselves, "I've always struggled with this. I've always been that kind of person. This is just who I am." Those stories are memories, too. They were formed the same way. They've been reconstructed the same way. And reconsolidation works in both directions. Every time you retell a story about your own failure, your own limitation, your own past, you're not just describing something that happened, you're rebuilding it. And the rebuilt version goes back into storage, a little more solid than before, a little more certain, a little more permanent feeling. The story becomes the truth. Not because it's accurate, but because it's been told so many times that the reconstruction has become seamless. The gaps have been filled, the edges have been smoothed, and the brain has no mechanism to go back and check against the original. Because there is no original. There's only the most recent version. Think about what that means for a moment. The memories that feel the most certain, the ones you'd stake something real on, the ones that form the foundation of how you understand your own life, those aren't necessarily the most accurate. They're the most rehearsed. The memory of the argument you keep replaying, the childhood moment that explains why you are the way you are, the conversation that proved something about yourself or someone else, and that you've returned to, quietly, hundreds of times since. Each visit changed it, and you had no way of knowing, because every version felt like the truth. The brain was never trying to deceive. It was doing something actually more sophisticated than recording. It was interpreting, making meaning, connecting the past to the present in ways that help navigate forward. But interpretation is not accuracy, and the most honest thing behavioral psychology has to offer, after decades of research, hundreds of experiments, thousands of participants, is this: the most unreliable narrator of your own life is you. Not because something is wrong with you, not because you're careless or dishonest, but because that's what memory is. That's what it was always doing. And the strange thing, the thing that takes a moment to fully land, is that knowing this doesn't make the past less meaningful, it just makes it a little less fixed. Send this to someone you've argued with about a shared memory. Not to win, just to open a more interesting conversation. And if you want more, hit subscribe. We translate psychology into something you can actually use.